There's no other way to put it. Colton Cowser was robbed of the American League Rookie of the Year award. I'll tell you why, plus get to plenty of other Orioles news and notes coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Wednesday, November 20th, 2024, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb. And coming up on today's episode, we're going to run through a lot of Orioles news and notes to get to. Some things that came up over the past couple of days, including Colton Cowser somehow not winning AL Rookie of the Year, the Orioles adding Brandon Young and Kade Strowd to the 40-man roster to protect them from the Rule 5 draft, Burns and Santander declining their qualifying offers, and much more. And that's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Just visit FanDuel.com to get started today. So let's jump right into this one, because I am recording here on Tuesday evening. This news was announced on Monday evening, but just because of my recording schedule, this had to be put on the top here of the Wednesday episode. Still, maybe not in full shock, but still a little bit surprised about what we learned on Monday evening, that the BBWA voters did not select Colton Cowser to be the 2024 American League Rookie of the Year. Now, he was never the runaway favorite at any point this year. Well, maybe in April, he was considered the runaway favorite. After that, he was a candidate. And by the end of the year, it looked like, hey, there are some strong contenders. There are multiple names in this race. But everybody kind of agreed, hey, Cowser's probably the best choice here. Again, was not a slam dunk. There are certainly arguments across the board to vote for other candidates, number one. But it is very surprising that Cowser did not win this award. It was announced on Monday night that Luis Gil, the right-handed starting pitcher of the New York Yankees, was named American League Rookie of the Year, with Cowser finishing second and Yankees catcher Austin Wells finishing third. Those were the three finalists. Now, here's how the voting broke down. You can see it here if you're watching on the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe right here. As you can see, there were 30 voters, as there are for every award. 15 of them put Luis Gil in first place. 13 of them put Cowser in first place. And then one put Mason Miller, the A's closer, in first place. And another put Guardians setup man Cade Smith as the final first place vote. Now, it's a little bit annoying that two relievers, none of them were finalists, were each given first place votes. Honestly, Cade Smith was so good that I don't even mind it. The Mason Miller first place vote was from basically an A's writer. Yeah, that one, Cade Smith one doesn't bother me. He was electric. The Mason Miller one bothers me a little bit. Now, Cowser did have more down ballot votes. He had 11 second place votes to Gil's 10. He had 3 third place votes to Gil's 1. But because Luis Gil had the more first place votes, which garnered the more points, he ended up with a total of 106 points, while Cowser had 101, and Austin Wells, who finished third, had 17. So it was a clear 2-horse race by the end between these two guys. Other guys garnering votes, Wilyer Abreu, the Red Sox outfielder, and Wyatt Langford, the Rangers outfielder, both got on some ballots to show up on this list as well. But Luis Gil winning the award, the starting pitcher for the Yankees. Now, Gil was actually left off of 4 of the 30 ballots. Cowser was left off of 3 of the 30 ballots. To be honest, not really sure how you leave either of those guys off the ballot, but especially Colton Cowser. Now, listen, WAR is not the end-all be-all, right? It's not a stat that should just fully encapsulate how we vote for these awards. But Colton Cowser did lead all AL rookies in FanGraphs WAR. He was at 4.0. Luis Gil was at 2.2. So this is not a situation where, one guy was 4 WAR, one guy was 3.5 WAR, and it's not a big thing here. Cowser was basically worth double the value, according to WAR, that Luis Gil was this season. So there's that to take into account. The funny thing is, now Mason Miller and Cade Smith, they each threw like 75 plus fewer innings than Gil because Gil was a starter all year, and both of those guys were relievers, and even Miller spent some time on the injured list. But if you go by FanGraphs WAR, because Miller and Smith were so dominant, they each actually accrued more value WAR-wise than Luis Gil did this season. That's right. Colton Cowser was first in that category. Luis Gil was eighth among AL rookies with the 2.2 F4. He was not even in the top three in that category. And Luis Gil also missed some time with a back strain, a few weeks from August to September. And he did not finish the season well. That's the other thing that's surprising here. Like, yes, both of these guys made the strongest parts of their cases early in the season. Colton Cowser was arguably the best hitter in baseball, or at least a top 5 hitter in baseball in the month of April, kind of burst onto the scene. Luis Gil was dominant for the first 2 months of the year, like was one of the best starters in the league. And both guys were not as good at times down the stretch, but Gil, much more than Cowser, really struggled. He had a 4.20 ERA in the second half of the season. Now, his overall season stats, 29 starts, 151 and 2/3 innings, 3.50 ERA for Luis Gil with a 27% strikeout rate and a 12% walk rate. But he struggled down the stretch. He had a 5.25 ERA in August, a 4+ ERA in September. And I could be a little biased because I did watch Luis Gil give up 8 runs in less than 2 innings in a June start against the Orioles at Yankee Stadium. That was kind of the beginning of the downfall of Luis Gil's season. But meanwhile, there's this narrative that Colton Cowser fell apart in the second half and that his season was totally propped up by his amazing April. Like, yes, Cowser was incredible in April, and then he was really bad in May. But after that, he was good for the rest of the season. And he ended up playing in 153 games, over 560 plate appearances, /242, 321, 447, a 120 WRC+. He had 24 home runs as a rookie. He played fantastic defense, came in second in the Gold Glove, should have won the Gold Glove in left field in the American League. It was a great all-around season for Colton Cowser. He wasn't perfect. He went through slumps. He had his ups and downs, but with this class, it was worthy of winning this award. And somehow, for the first time since 1981, both Rookie of the Year winners were pitchers, with Paul Skeens winning it in the National League. And it's something you just don't see as much because, guys, voters generally vote more towards position players who are out there every day rather than starters who are out there every 5th day. And I'm just kind of surprised the voters went against an everyday position player who produced. He played Gold Glove defense. He had the stats to back it up. And instead, they took a guy who has really high walk rates. I mean, Luis Gil, again, a 12% walk rate as a starting pitcher. Not good. Also, I mentioned 29 starts and 151 innings. He was basically averaging 5 innings per start. It's not like he was throwing deep into games. He was a 5-and-dive guy this year. And maybe that'll change, but generally that can shoo some voters away. But I don't know. I mean, Colton Cowser, again, it wasn't any kind of slam dunk. There was certainly a chance I thought Luis Gil had of winning this award. I thought there was a much smaller chance, but a chance someone like Austin Wells or Cade Smith even had of winning this award. But when you break it all down, Cowser is the most deserving of them all, and it stinks that he did not win it. And honestly, people who voted Gil first and Cowser second, like, I don't mind that ballot at all. Those were the 2 best rookies. You could make the argument in the league this year. Like, that's fine. The people that irk me is the 3 voters who didn't have Colton Cowser on the ballot. You didn't put him in your top 3 of rookies in the American League. That's what skewed this vote. Like, pull it together. Like, know some ball. Watch some ball. And I get it. Luis Gil is a Yankee. And everybody knows the Yankees. And he's going to get a Yankee bump. And maybe that's what swung it here because the margin was so thin that allowed Gil to finish in first place and win the award. And again, not a slam dunk, but Colton Cowser, he deserved this award, and it's unfortunate that he didn't win it because, as I mentioned, like, that's the other thing. Usually how a guy finishes helps with this award. Gil was bad in the last 2 months. Cowser had a 133 WRC+ in the second half of the season. His second half was better than his first half. Not really sure about the narrative that he finished poorly. He finished strong for this Orioles team, and yet still did not get the votes that he needed. It's unfortunate. And the other bad part is the Orioles miss out on that compensation draft pick. Remember, they got one from Gunnar Henderson, winning Rookie of the Year last year, that PPI pick. Cowser's not going to get it because the Orioles did not come in first place in the voting. It would have been a pick after the first round, somewhere in the 30s. That's a very valuable draft pick. Now, the Yankees won't get a pick because Luis Gil did not qualify for the parameters of a player that is eligible for the draft pick if he wins the Rookie of the Year award. And the other thing is, I get that he's eligible as a rookie because he had been so injured, but Luis Gil was pitching in the big leagues. He made his major league debut in 2021, and he won the Rookie of the Year in 2024. Now, that's because he had the Tommy John. He missed all of last year and most of the 22 season as well, and he came up right at the end of 21. But, like, come on. Come on, people. Like, come on. It's unfortunate. It is what it is. Still a great season from Cowser. He's still an Oriole moving forward. We should get better production from him in 2025. Just thinks that he can get the hardware, and of course thinks that the Orioles did not get the draft pick. But moving on from there, we had another batch of Orioles news come out on Tuesday. It was the Rule 5 protection deadline. We'll explain what that means and also which players the Orioles protected to that roster. That is coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's at FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. So we move on to Tuesday's big news. Monday was the Rookie of the Year awards, and Tuesday, probably the bigger thing than the qualifying offer deadline, which we'll get to, was the Rule 5 protection deadline. That was at 6 p.m. Eastern time on Tuesday. Basically, this is a deadline to add players to your 40-man roster in order to protect them from the Rule 5 draft, basically making sure that you can keep them around in your organization and eventually on your big league team. Now, Connor, what is the Rule 5 draft? What are you protecting them from? Well, essentially, the Rule 5 draft has been around for a while, but it was created so MLB-ready players who are still in the minor leagues can't just be hidden or kind of just sit in a team's minor league system forever and waste away because they are blocked from getting to the major league level for whatever reason, whether a team is manipulating the service time, whether a team is just really elite at that position in the big leagues, and so this great player just has to sit making a minor league salary forever, whatever it may be. The draft gives you parameters so guys just can't sit in a system and waste away until they become minor league free agents. It's a fairly pro player system that they have in the Rule 5 draft. Now, the general guidelines, they're a little more specific than this, especially when it comes to international signings and things like that. But the general guidelines are 4 years after you've been drafted out of college or 5 years after you've been drafted out of high school. That is when you do become Rule 5 eligible. So by that point, your team needs to either already have you on the 40-man roster. So that happens for a lot of guys. For example, technically Heston Kjerstad is eligible for this right now. But guess what? He's been on the 40-man roster since late 2023, so he doesn't come into play because he's already on that 40-man. It's guys who have not been added and, of course, are not yet in the big leagues because you have to be on the 40-man before you can even get to the major leagues. So if you fall into those categories, 4 years out of college, 5 years out of high school, you are Rule 5 eligible. If you are not added to the 40-man roster by that winter, which is where we have hit that time, so it's guys who were drafted out of high school in 2019 and guys who were drafted out of college in 2020, those are the people that are eligible this year. That team, in order to keep you around for good, must hold you on the MLB roster if they do select you in the Rule 5 draft. Again, if you are not added to the 40-man roster, then another team can select you in that Rule 5 draft. And that team, in order to keep you around for good, must hold you on the big league roster or the major league injured list for the entirety of the following season. So, for example, back in December of 2020, the Orioles selected two right-handed pitchers in the Rule 5 draft. It was Tyler Wells and Max Soroller, because those guys were not protected by the Twins and the Reds, their two initial teams, and they were left them open to the Rule 5 draft. Now, both were placed on the Major League roster. Soroller ended up flaming out. The Orioles said this isn't worth it, so they returned him back to the Reds. But Tyler Wells stuck, and the Orioles kept him on the injured list for a while, but also in the big leagues in 2021. And then once the season was over, they had kept him in the bigs all year. He was officially a part of the Orioles organization moving forward. And that worked out because despite the injuries, Tyler Wells has been an important part of the Orioles pitching staff since then. And that is just another way to acquire players. So if you are added to the 40-man roster, again, you're safe to stay with that organization. Now you get that bigger paycheck on the 40-man. But those 40-man spots are meaningful. So if you do get added by this deadline and are protected, that usually means that the team has some sort of belief in you that you're going to debut in the big leagues or help them pretty soon. And that is where we get to the two players who the Orioles decided to protect from the Rule 5 draft and add to the 40-man roster. The first was the slam dunk selection in this category. That is Brandon Young. Brandon Young was one of the easier names right here because of how good he was in 2024 in AAA. Brandon Young is a 26-year-old right-handed pitcher who the Orioles signed as an undrafted free agent out of Louisiana after the 2020 draft. Remember that 2020 COVID draft was shortened to 5 rounds, and then basically everybody became an undrafted free agent after that. There were different bonus pool monies, but a lot of guys signed with teams. You had your pick of the litter, and Brandon Young chose the Orioles. And I did misspeak earlier. It is actually guys who were drafted out of college in 2021 and high school in 2020 who were eligible this year. My mistake. Brandon Young was eligible last year, but he was still near the end of, but still going through Tommy John surgery recovery at that point. And that was one of the big reasons why he was not selected last year. But he pitched very well this year and got himself into a spot to be protected. He threw 89 innings in AAA this year after he threw 22 innings in AA just to build back up coming off the injury. 89 innings in AAA. He had a 3.44 ERA on the season with a 26% strikeout rate to just a 9% walk rate. And the stuff was good for Brandon Young. FanGraphs ranks him as the number 6 ranked prospect currently in the Orioles system. That was a ranking done during the 2024 season. And while he's not on any top 100 lists right now, I would not be surprised at all if Young shows up on a league-wide top 100 prospect list at some point this offseason. Now, in terms of the stuff, he got some good stuff. Now, it's changed a little bit since the injury. Again, he had his second Tommy John of his life early in 2022, missed all the rest of that season, missed most of 23. Also had another Tommy John like 12 years ago when he was a young teenager, really young to get that first surgery. But he looked ready to go in 2024, was pitching well. Mike Elias even mentioned him as a possible big league rotation option at the end of the 2024 season. So he was clearly on the Orioles' minds. At that point, we knew, hey, they're going to protect him. It's a fastball in the low 90s, low to mid 90s, but it's got really good shape, which means it kind of has that rising action on that fastball, or at least it looks like that to hitters. And he's got some exciting secondary pitches, a slider, a curveball, and a changeup for Brandon Young to go with it. And he is a former guest of the Locked On Orioles podcast. We had him on the show in September, talking a lot about his pitching, his injuries, his rise through the system, the fact that he just got a smartphone. He's had a flip phone for most of his life. Make sure to go back and check that one out. But the stuff is good. Like, yeah, his fastball, he throws at 92, 93. You're like, what's so special about that? Opponents hit 179 against it because that kind of rising faction, that curveball's got really good whiff rates. He was introducing kind of a cutter this year as well. It's a wide arsenal. He's got 5 pitches. He throws them for strikes, which is really nice to see. He is an option in this Oriole rotation in 2025. And when I previewed this Rule 5 deadline, I said, listen, no doubt about it, they're going to protect Brandon Young. And my prediction was that Young was going to be the only guy. But he was not. I mentioned a couple more names of pitchers that could be on the chopping block that the Orioles could consider. And one of them was right-handed pitcher Kade Strowd. And the Orioles did protect him as well. Now, who is Kade Strowd? Strowd was a 12th round pick of the Orioles back in 2019, the first Mike Elias draft. They got him out of West Virginia University. And listen, he's already 27 years old. Like, it stinks for him that he hasn't gotten to the big leagues yet. And it certainly wasn't the greatest ERA to look at in 2024. He started the year in Double-A, didn't give up a run in 10 and a third innings, and then the Orioles immediately promoted him to Triple-A for the first time in his career. And he threw 41 innings, and he had an awesome 31% strikeout rate. He also had a 14% walk rate, not good. Opponents also hit 295 against him, not very good. And he had a 6.80 ERA in AAA. Now, that goes with a 4.98 FIP and a 3.77 xFIP for Strowd, which basically tells you he was getting extremely unlucky to lead to a 6.80 ERA. And the fact that he had a 53% ground ball rate, that shows you he is a really big-time ground ball pitcher. He was getting seriously unlucky. I'm going to show you the pitch mix for Kade Strowd in AAA Norfolk this year. You can see it. This is courtesy of Baseball Savant if you are watching on the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel. Cutter, four-seamer, curveball, sweeper, and changeup. Pretty wide arsenal for a reliever. He'll probably cut that down when he gets to the big leagues. But he used to be known for his big fastball. Like it averaged 96, but he'd throw it 97, 98 regularly. It doesn't have great shape, that fastball. It doesn't have that big-time rising action. Now, he still gets a lot of swing and misses on it because it has a little bit of action on it that makes it tough to hit at times. But opponents are still able to hit it a bit and square it up. 53% hard hit rate against that four-seam fastball. That is not good. But the cutter was the pitch he kind of moved to in AAA to be his main offering. Now, opponents did hit 381 against it, but with only a 28% hard hit rate, basically, he was giving up a lot of soft singles, essentially. Now, there were some extra base hits when guys got a hold of it and he didn't command it well, but there were also a good amount of soft singles that kind of beat Strowd into the ground in AAA this year. He's got really good whiff rates on the curveball, on the sweeper. It's got a good stuff. Plus, on the changeup, 38% whiff rate. It's a really good combo of pitches. Now, I think the Orioles are still going to want to hone that in a little bit. You don't see a lot of relievers, minus Danny Coulomb, who throw 5 pitches out there, especially guys with 97-mile-per-hour fastballs. But he was able to command his cutter better. He just has command issues. He's always had them. He's had super high walk rates. You know, Eric Longenhagen had a write-up about him at Fangraphs. He did rank him as the number 36 ranked prospect in the Orioles system earlier this year and just said, hey, the stuff's really good. The command's not. He talked about how he generally will like spike pitches 10 feet in front of home plate, just non-competitive, misses at times, but the stuff was there. And that's why I think the Orioles ended up pulling the trigger and protecting Kade Strowd, because I don't think this means he will like make the opening day bullpen for the Orioles in 2025. There is still some development to go, but I think the Orioles added him to the 40-man because they thought, hey, we think there's a really good reliever in there with how good that stuff is. And we are so close to honing it in. He's in AAA. He's getting there. We're working with him. But they may have thought, hey, his stuff is so good and he's already 27 that we're scared that some other team is going to select him in the Rule 5 draft if we don't protect him. And because we care about him enough and think he is a future major league bullpen piece, they felt the pros outweighed the cons. It was probably a tough decision, but felt the pros outweighed the cons and decided to protect him to the 40-man roster. Again, probably isn't fully ready yet, but the stuff is good enough where it could be soon, and the O's were worried they would lose him. So for Brandon Young, I mean, realistically, he's going to compete for a rotation spot next year. Strowd, more of an intriguing bullpen arm. Because he's on the 40-man, there's a good chance he will pitch for the Orioles in 2025. Maybe he's not in the biggest parts of their plans, but the O's hope it clicks for him at some point. Sometimes it takes a while for these relievers for it to click. It took a while for Felix Bautista to click, and when it finally does, and you have the stuff like Strowd does, it can make a huge impact. Now, in terms of other players who were not protected, not a lot of shockers here. There were some arms I mentioned, Justin Armbruster, Keegan Gillies, Alex Pham, a few of them who have had some really good minor league numbers at times, but not really ready. And it's possible one of them could be picked by another team in the Rule 5 draft, but not likely. And of course, even though the Orioles didn't protect them, they're hoping to hold on to those arms and keep them in their system. But a couple more things to get to news and notes wise. We'll talk about the qualifying offer. That deadline was also on Tuesday. That's coming up next to finish off the pod. So the other deadline that came up in Major League Baseball on Tuesday was the qualifying offer deadline. Now, what is the qualifying offer? I've talked about it a little bit, but essentially it is a way to allow teams that have quote unquote low payrolls, small market, whatever it may be, when their big-time players hit free agency and are about to get contracts that they allegedly cannot afford, it allows for those small market teams to get some sort of compensation back. So you offer the qualifying offer. This year, it was a 1-year, $21 million deal. Sometimes players accept it and they come back and play for that contract. But if they don't accept it, then the offering team, as long as that player signs for $50 million or more with another team, the offering team of the qualifying offer gets some draft pick compensation to just get a little bit back from a player that, again, allegedly they are unable to sign in free agency. And the Orioles, there were 13 players total that were offered a qualifying offer this year. The Orioles offered it to two of them, both Anthony Santander and Corbin Burnes, their top two free agents. And as was expected by the deadline on Tuesday, both of those players officially have declined the qualifying offer. So neither of them accepted a 1-year, $21 million deal. And that is, of course, because both of them will be getting more years and more money than that in free agency. I thought there was maybe an outside chance that Santander would consider accepting it, but it was more than likely he would not. And of course, he did not. So if either of or both of these players sign with another team for more than $50 million total, the Orioles will get a draft pick that sits after round one. So somewhere in the 30s of the 2025 draft. If Santander and Burnes sign with other teams, the O's will get 2 draft picks. You can compound them and get multiple. Now, the Orioles are hoping they don't just end up with draft picks, so I think they'd love to have both of these guys back on their roster, but that is what happens if the qualifying offers, again, not accepted, as they were not, and then those guys do end up not returning to Baltimore. Only one player accepted the qualifying offer of the 13. That was Nick Martinez of the Reds. Most people expected him to accept it. All the other guys, they became full free agents as well. But there is an interesting note on Corbin Burnes I want to finish on because, of course, he was one of the 2 Orioles that did decline that qualifying offer. Ken Rosenthal, in one of his notes columns this week, reported that the Orioles are in on Garrett Crochet, the lefty for the White Sox, who seems to be the number 1 trade piece for any team this offseason. It's not surprising that the O's are in on Crochet. We know they were checking in on him at the trade deadline. We know they're checking in again, but a lot of teams are in on Crochet. And in the past, with the John Angelos budget, the best way for the Orioles to acquire starting pitching was via trade. We saw them do that to get Corbin Burnes last winter from the Brewers. But now with David Rubenstein in charge, you can start to pay for these players. And Rosenthal reported that the Orioles, quote, despite being in on Crochet, are, quote, currently more focused on free agency, end quote, when it comes to starting pitching. And Ken wrote that ownership has given Mike Elias the flexibility to explore the entire free agent starting pitching market, starting all the way at the top with Corbin Burnes. And that is exciting. And John Morosi of MLB Network, who, again, gigantic grain of salt to take with that one, when he tweeted last year that Ohtani was on a plane to Toronto to sign with the Blue Jays, and we all know that did not happen. But John Morosi reported this week that 2 teams, quote, stand above the others for Corbin Burnes, and it is the Dodgers and the Orioles that he put on this list. Now, who knows if the O's are really going to finally make this gigantic free agent pitching splash and get one of these top arms, whether it is Burnes, whether it's Blake Snell, whether it's Max Fried, to add a guy to the top of this rotation. Who knows if it's going to happen? They could be making serious offers, but just get outbid by other teams. The player could just choose another team for whatever reason. But every sign is pointing to the Orioles finally, for the first time in a long time, being serious players in the free agent market. Now, it remains to be seen who the O's are actually going to sign. We won't know for a while. Again, things don't really start picking up until at least the winter meetings, which are in early December. And then after that, sometimes you get some stuff, sometimes you don't. But either way, all of the reporting is telling us that it's a non-zero chance Corbin Burnes re-signs with the Orioles. Now, when I was asked this question multiple times on mailbags throughout the season, I said I gave the Orioles a 5% chance because in theory, each team has, a 3% chance to sign him with 30 teams. But a lot of teams are going to have a better shot than others, like the White Sox aren't signing Corbin Burnes and the Dodgers have a really good shot. I gave the Orioles up to 5% because I gave him a 2% bump for being the team he had just played for and just had success with before hitting free agency. I'm going to keep this Corbin Burnes meter going this offseason. I'm going to move from 5% to 10%. Now, it's still low, but in reality, you got to give teams like the Dodgers and the Mets and the Red Sox maybe still a bigger chance because they might even be willing to shell out even more money. But when you get down to it, I'm doubling that percentage. I'm putting Corbin Burnes at 10% being back with Baltimore. I'm still not saying it's the most likely ending here, but I'm starting to believe a little bit more that the Orioles might actually be serious here. Might actually be serious players and might really, I could be burned by this, but might really, pun intended, might really go after one of these top guys. And why not have it be Corbin Burnes? You know what he can give you. He just pitched here for a year, and he is the best starter with the best injury history of anyone who is available. So you know what? I'm bumping it to 10%, and maybe as we get more reporting, that could go even higher. But that'll do it for today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. We will be back tomorrow, continuing the Orioles player season review series. We're going to talk about two young players, Heston Kjerstad and Coby Mayo. Both were in the big leagues this year. Both have some questions surrounding what their roles could be next year. Could either of them even be traded this offseason? A lot of questions around those two guys. We'll break down their seasons and talk about those questions, try to answer them coming up on tomorrow's episode. But until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.